he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him. And on the third day, he will rise." But they understood none of these things. This saying was hidden from them, and they did not grasp what was said. And we'll end our reading at verse 34. Margaret Ann Lake died last week at the age of 80. You'll not recognize her by that name, but if I tell you she had a slot on a very popular Saturday night TV show that you may not have been allowed to watch, or only allowed to watch until the bit at the end, well, you look puzzled, a lot of you, don't you? When I tell you her stage name was Mystic Meg, many of you will know who I'm talking about. And if my granny was in the kitchen, I would have this still on the screen, and she wouldn't know it was on. And maybe Mystic Meg would come in with the smoke machines blowing up behind her and a crystal ball placed in front of her. And she made all of her predictions, didn't she, for the lottery, with all her astrology-laced references. Well, she wasn't exactly tight, was she, with the things that she had to say? If you remember, she was general. She was very general. She would say things like, "There will be a winner this week, someone who once walked through Coventry, a woman named Kathy is important, a grey cat, a blue uniform, insurance workers, bin men, and a dentist will be celebrating too." And she always ended it like that. You remember? It was comedy in the most part. Some people would take it seriously enough. They would read themselves back into it. "I've got a blue uniform, and I was in the dentist last week, and I won a tenner. She's good, isn't she?" That's the sort of thing people would say. But she couldn't predict anything, of course. It was just a comical stunt. You throw the net wide enough with your guesses, then of course you'll get something right. If I said that the sun will rise tomorrow and it will rain somewhere in Northern Ireland, you wouldn't start calling me a prophet, would you? Because the net's just far too wide. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's on the road to the cross. And we're making our way through 6 passages on the journey as in Luke's gospel, all which mention Jesus and his followers on the way to Jerusalem. Last time, this morning, of course, Jesus met and healed 10 lepers, men with serious skin disease and that was contagious, and they were really good at social distancing, and one of them is really good at saying thank you. The others not so. Tonight, let's think about what was written. What was written. This time, Jesus takes the opportunity to tell the disciples the purpose of their trip. The purpose of their trip. For after Jesus uses that word "see" there in verse 31, it's "behold" in the King James, and we had the King James up on the screen this morning, didn't we? That's a look here sort of word. See. He says, listen up. For Jesus, well, he's about to make a prediction. And then Jesus, again, here referring to himself as the Son of Man, as he does often, he says that we're going up to Jerusalem. And you do go up to Jerusalem. It's a climb. It's 2,500 feet above sea level, Jerusalem, so you have to go up. And he tells them that they're going to Jerusalem, up to Jerusalem, and that everything that was written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. He says what was written, what is written, has to be fulfilled. And when it comes to prophecies, when it comes to predictions in the Old Testament about the one that was promised, about the Messiah, well, how tight were they in terms of predictions? How tight were they? Let's consider a few. Genesis 3:15. Let's get them on the screen. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." The Messiah will be born of woman. Not very tight, that, is it? Everyone's born of woman. There are billions of us born of woman, as we've been celebrating today, haven't we? Being born of woman. Genesis 24 verse 17 says this: a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. The Messiah, this is teaching, predicting, would be a descendant of Jacob. Well, there's a whole nation descended of Jacob, the Jewish nation, so that's also fairly general, isn't it? What about Hosea 11 verse 1? A prediction: out of Egypt I called my son, predicts Hosea, God's prophet. The Messiah would spend some time in Egypt. Again, that's not very specific, is it? A good lot of people have been to Egypt, you have to imagine. Plenty of them. Micah 5 verse 2 says, but you, Bethlehem, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel. The Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. That's a small place, as the verse says. This is getting tighter, isn't it? What about Isaiah 7 verse 14? Sorry, I forgot the Micah one. You'll have to forgive me. Isaiah 7 verse 14 says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. The Messiah would be born of a virgin and would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now we're getting somewhere, aren't we? Because that's hard to predict. This is something in the realm of the impossible that we're now into. Something in the realm of the impossible with man, but possible with God, as Jesus has just been teaching in verse 27 about camels going through the eye of a needle. What was written. Secondly, tonight, what he will allow to happen. Jesus, after referring to what has been written about the Messiah, and we've outlined just a very short list of the many, there are many more. When we think about prophecy and the Bible and prophetic books, we need to remember, don't we, that the vast majority of it's not about the end times or us. It's about Jesus' ministry, work, the first time he comes around. That's what it's mainly about. Jesus, having referred to what was written, goes on to spell out his own predictions, doesn't he? From verse number 32. His own prophecy. That's what he's doing. And it's a prediction that involves his own death. Most people try not to think about their own death. Isn't that right? Most people assume it's either years away or are aware that the aging process is affecting them all right, but that the time will come when it comes. And tend not to dwell on it too much. They don't tell others about it. It's not the sort of thing you talk about in polite company. Mystic Meg did not predict her own demise last week. But Jesus, he predicts his own death, doesn't he? And he's done this twice already in Luke's Gospel. In fact, both of them in chapter 9. We have them on the screen. Verse 22, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And verse 44, let these words sink into your ears, he says to the disciples. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, but they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them, so that they might not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this saying. The first one, doesn't it? It highlights, it's light on details, isn't it, this prediction? We've got lots of suffering mentioned, not quite specifically so. We've got the idea of rejection by the Jewish leaders, the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, the religious and political establishment. And then we've got that really shocking promise that he would be killed. And then on the third day, he'd be raised. The second prediction there, verse 44, has even less on the detail. It has the idea of Jesus being merely delivered into the hands of men, a fairly general statement. But, of course, the third prediction, our passage tonight, contains much more detail. He predicts a process that will happen to him, Jesus, a process that gets, progressively worse and worse. It's all there in verse 32 and 33. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles, first of all. In the second prediction on the screen, we get that the men are identified as Gentiles here, but in the second prediction, we're told who was doing the delivering. We're told that it was the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law that were doing the delivery. So you put the two of them together, the two predictions, and you get the idea that Jesus is going to be handed over by the Jewish authorities to the Gentiles, to the Romans. That's fairly specific, isn't it? And will be mocked, we're told. He's going to be delivered over and will be mocked in verse 32. Now, that's worse, isn't it, than being delivered. You can be in custody, but to be mocked in custody is worse. Psalm 22 predicts this, actually, in verse number 7. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. David's writing this psalm, but it's really about Jesus. And this is what he says. And it's fulfilled in chapter 22 of Luke later on. Mocking, of course, is here is this silent sort of wagging of the head and these expressions of the mouth. And it goes along here with Jesus predicting that he will be shamefully treated, we read, which is now verbal. Mocking leads on to verbal insults that are being hurled. And then we have it in Psalm 69, more in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause. Mighty are those who would destroy me, those who attack me with lies. They're using their words to speak lies. But there's worse to come from your mouth, isn't there? And that is to be spat upon. That is a vile thing in our minds, and it is. An insult of insults. If it happens on a football pitch, they throw the book at them, don't they? And so they should. Isaiah 50 verse 6 predicts this too. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting, it says at the end. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. That's fulfilled in Mark 14 verse 65. And then worse than that is flogging. That's what we're talking about as Jesus speaks further. After flogging him, he writes. The same is mentioned here in Isaiah 50, verse 6. I gave my back to those who strike, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. Of course, a Roman flogging is no laughing matter. A scourging, as it's called, was no small matter. It was as harsh as it was brutal, with rivers of blood running down the victim's back from the whipping and the beating, with fragments of bone used in the whip. This was a terrifying experience. And it's fulfilled in Mark chapter 15. The final insult that Jesus mentions in verse 33 is to kill, to execute, to end permanently. Jesus has already said this in prediction 1. He would suffer, be rejected, and be killed. In Luke 13, he said these words in verse 32. It cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem. He's going to perish in Jerusalem. That's fairly tight, isn't it? He's going to be killed there. He predicts that he'll be killed in Jerusalem. It's the end game for those who want rid of him. It's the end game that they're after. It's the end of his following. It's the end of his newfangled teaching that he's been sharing in the temple and in the synagogues. It's the end of his making everyone else look bad with how good he is. But this is not the end, of course. Notice that up to now, Jesus is allowing this to happen to him. That's implied from the way he predicts it, yes, but it's also the way the verbs are sort of put. They're all what we call passive. They are what Jesus is going to have done to him. He will be delivered. That implies someone is delivering him. He will be mocked. That implies that someone is mocking him. He will be shamefully treated, which again implies that someone's going to shamefully treat him. He will be spit upon. They will kill him. But notice the difference in the thing that happens to him. At the end of verse 33, on the third day, he will rise. That's a different verb, different way of looking at it. It's not them acting now. This is called the middle voice. You don't need to know that. But suffice to say, it's that he will rise. He will rise. It's different. On the third day, specific time scale. His death will not be the end game for Jesus. No, rather he predicts his own rising, his own resurrection, and his own rising on the third day. His own victory, in fact, over death and hell and the devil. And we read it tonight. Revelation 1:17 says, "Fear not, I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and have the keys of death and Hades." He's victorious. He died, and he is alive forevermore. What was written, what he allowed to happen, and finally, what is understood at the time. Now, this is strange for us. Many of us grew up with this story. Some of us have read this over and over and heard preachers preach on it many, many times. And we perhaps question the intelligence of the disciples. The 12 that are referred to there in verse 31, of course, are the disciples that are present with him. And we wonder how on earth they didn't get it, even as Jesus spells it out not once or twice, but 3 times in Luke. Of course, just because things are taken for granted in the church now and for 2,000 years it's been like that, doesn't mean that they were easy to understand for the original disciples. Let's go a little easy on them. Yes, Jesus is presenting himself as the means of the fulfilling of the promises of the Old Testament, and they were supposed to know the Old Testament. Yes, he comes inaugurating and sort of completing the map of the Jewish faith, and they were part of the Jewish faith. But do note that even as Jesus comes fulfilling what's promised in the Old Testament, some of which is very specific and hard to argue with, he still comes with some shocks along the way. Because it comes as a shock that he would come and soon remove circumcision or food laws or the sacrificial system as a whole. That's a big shock, you have to admit. Big surprise that he would bring in the Samaritans, that he would bring in the Gentiles as Samaritans and Gentiles. That's a big surprise. But the biggest surprise of all, of course, is that he would die. Messiahs don't die. Or better put, the Messiah doesn't die. And if you really aren't expecting something, particularly surrounding matters of death and loved ones, then we may fail to hear what comes from the mouth of someone with authority on the subject, despite the clarity with which they speak. I'm sure you can imagine a situation where someone could tell you something very plainly, but because it's a matter of someone you love and a matter of sickness or indeed death, you find it very difficult to believe them or to even hear what they've said. Perhaps you react in disbelief to such news, or you have done before, or a tough medical prognosis from someone who can well predict what the future will hold for your loved one. The Messiah, you see, he's a victorious coming king in David's line. His kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom, and God told Solomon that you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Death is not in the equation when they think about Jesus, if this is who he is. They thought the suffering servant of Isaiah was perhaps somebody else. Not that they would be one and the same person, that the suffering servant would be the glorious Messiah coming in David's line. He's about to do another miracle, Jesus, at the end of chapter 18. He's about to heal a blind beggar. Another glory moment. Where's the need to suffer? Why can't it just be onwards and upwards? They were looking for the glorious Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven from Daniel chapter 7, which is even before Daniel gets complicated, right? And this is clearly a messianic vision of one coming in glory that they read about. They saw no death in the plan for him. But there was death in the plan. There was rejection and despising. There was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. There was mockery in the plan. There was shameful treatment in the plan. There was spitting. There was flogging in the plan, what's called scourging in the Roman system. There was crucifixion to come in Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans, passed off from the hands of the Jewish authorities. Yes, we're told, aren't we, in one of those predictions that they didn't understand or grasp these things because they were hidden from them. We're told that also in verse 34. You see, God has to reveal truth to you, or you just don't see it. That's key in this, for sure. And it'll take until Luke 24, verse 45, before they will fully understand, when the two on the road to the Emmaus sort of start the ball rolling on understanding who Jesus is for the disciples. When their eyes are opened before God, and the disciples, less Judas, they follow suit from that moment. But let's not be too hard on them, the disciples. Let's think about ourselves here for a moment. How do we view the rest of the prophecies in this book? Even the ones that are very clear, the ones yet to be fulfilled, where Jesus will come in glorious splendor in his second coming, and every eye will see him, and he's given dominion over the whole earth, and all nations and peoples and languages will serve him. Daniel 7, no less. And the world will be divided into the sheep and the goats, where at the great judgment seat the faithful will be welcomed into everlasting glory, and the faithless will be doomed forever to everlasting torment. Where in a new heaven and a new earth we'll forever be with our Savior in glorious bodies, like his glorious post-resurrection body. Do we live in that reality? Really? Because that's where we're headed. Or do we kind of park it somewhere in the far off by and by, as it were, and refuse to let that information get us too passionate or keen to tell others? What do? Are we busy ourselves in all things here and now? Do we think about telling others that they're shut out unless they turn and entrust their lives to Jesus? We see them, only the disciples, we see them sort of holding on to the kind of nice half of the picture, the glorious bit. And we decry their sort of glory-only short-sightedness when they think about what's before them. But do we do that too? Are we sort of short-sighted about the whole picture? I'm speaking about maybe our expectations of how we think our lives should go, which colours how we react to things that come that don't meet our expectations. When we hear that we're on the winning side and expect that our definition of winning to be the only narrative in our lives. How often can we fall off the wagon spiritually if things don't go our way? When our marriages are tough, when relations are frayed with our parents, or when our body is creaking more than we'd expect it to. When in actual fact, that is the very thing that God is using for our ultimate good, and more importantly, still for his glory. Just like the disciples, we like the good bits, don't we? I'm just the same as you, by the way. We want the instant and we want the glorious. But God presents a plan that involves suffering before any glory comes. That's for Jesus, and it's also for you and I, where we're called to be his witnesses. But you know what? It's hard. It's hard to share your faith, isn't it? Certainly in the current situation. It involves putting yourself sort of out there and facing the statistical more likely rejection. Much easier to keep your head sort of below the parapet and hang tight for heavenly glory than to give someone an invite to the Good Friday outreach event and potentially rescue them from eternal punishment, permanent suffering. Our temporary suffering, even as part of living in a broken world, facing bad news and real challenging difficulty, well, it can be used by God, can't it, to shape and fashion us in a Christ-like way? But we still rather not have it. We still rather not have it. And then we can sort of let the difficulty come and almost let it pass us by, that it's a ministry moment. That it's a ministry moment for God to be at work. But God hasn't. And God doesn't. Maybe you don't want to hear this. You don't want to hear that. You want to hear that it'll go well for you, and very well for you, for you know Jesus and you're on the winning side. But I'm sorry, but it didn't go well for him, although of course ultimately it did. And that's the pattern. There are no mistakes in the plan of God. There is no mistakes as Jesus travels on his road to his Jerusalem destiny. I said that the resurrection was Jesus acting. And the other things were passive, things that were being done to him, that he will be delivered over, and that he will be mocked, and that he will be shamefully treated, and that he will be spit upon and will be flogged. But actually, these things are actually less about them in the way it's written, and more what they call the divine passive. In other words, this is God acting. That's the ultimate idea here. Ultimately, it's God that does this. The divine passive, they call it. It's the idea that he is at work, like the way in verse 31, that everything written about the Son of Man will be accomplished. That's God at work. You see? It's the same idea through the rest of it, that he will be delivered. It's God at work. That he will be mocked. That's God at work. That he will be shamefully treated and spit upon and flogged and killed. And on the third day, well, he will rise again in the Spirit's power. When he predicts what he will allow to happen, well, he's allowing God's way to happen. Because this is plan A. And this has always been plan A. And the details of plan A are contained in hundreds of places, hundreds of years before, in plan A, in the documents of the Old Testament. And there are no mistakes for your life either in following him, even with some suffering now and glory to come. But I can tell you something, it won't be comparable with the glory that's to be revealed in us. I can tell you that. Paul tells us that in Romans 8, verse 18. The glory's coming. Perfect health and perfect relationships in a perfect world. Well, that requires the end of sin, doesn't it? But that's in the plan. That's in the plan. And one day, it will be glory. Let's pray together, shall we? Let's pray together.